Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sylvester Johnson, the Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. And I want to thank you for joining us today for our faculty research colloquium. I also want to thank Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, which is the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and also Dominique Francesca, who is the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work that makes this event possible. Today, we are joined by Dr. Audrey Reeves. Dr. Reeves is an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech. She's currently writing a book manuscript entitled Affect and World Politics, Governing Bodies, Hearts, and Minds at Museums and Memorials. Her work uses feminist theories of affect and emotion to broaden understandings of security governance. She builds on feminist insistence that politics is embodied, and her work suggests that security governance includes not only propositional forms of expertise and influence, such as military strategy and academic papers, but also affective and experiential knowledges passed on through the way people move their bodies. Museum curators and architects intervene in security governance when they orchestrate bodily interactions with museums and memorial spaces. And those interactions generate powerful emotional experiences that shape the way citizens understand acceptable or unacceptable militarized activity. And so for this reason, affective expertise in her work plays an important role in democratic deliberation and also in consensus building that surrounds the questions of the legitimate use of force. Professor Reeves embodied an affective approach to the study of security politics, draws inspiration from her training in classical and contemporary ballet. Over the past 2 decades, she has trained at the Dance Conservatory in Montreal, in Canada, the dance area in Geneva, Switzerland, and also with the Third Stage Dance Company in Bristol in the UK. She has also become qualified as a forest yoga instructor. So we're really looking forward to this conversation with her today. And I'd like to remind our audience that we would love to receive your questions and your comments. And so we're going to segue about halfway through our program in order to hear from you. In the last half hour of our program, we will ask you to send us any questions or any comments that you have. And if you're joining us through the Zoom webinar, you can just click on that Q&A button in Zoom to send us your comments and your questions. If you're joining us through the YouTube Live interface, then you can also place your comments or your questions in the chat area for YouTube Live. So we look forward to that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Reeves. We're really delighted that you're with us.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Dr. Johnson, Sylvester. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, that's great. So I'm wondering if you might start by telling us how you became interested in war museums and in war memorials.
Yes, absolutely. When I was an undergraduate student, I was lucky enough to do a study abroad course. So I studied at the University of Montreal in Canada, and there was a summer course in Canadian military history offered on the Second World War and First World War battlefields in Belgium and France. And so I took the course, and this is really when it started for me, when I discovered that there was this whole universe of military cemeteries, memorials, museums that were actively educating people about matters of war and peace. And actually, I have a couple of photos that I can share with you from this experience, and that might help to contextualize a little bit where I came from with this. So this picture on the left-hand side is in northern France. So it's me in the picture running, though it's a bit blurry. And this is a site called the Vimy Memorial, where Canadian forces fought in the First World War, and that is quite crucial to Canadian military history. And what I'm doing here is I'm running in the trenches, because what we learned on site was that there was a particularly dangerous position that some soldiers occupied, which was that of the trench runner. So the trench runners were those people who carried messages in the trenches, because at the time the wireless communication was not what we have today. So the safest way to deliver a message was to run through the trenches. And most trench runners were shorter soldiers, because it was less dangerous for them to run through the trenches, though it was still one of the most dangerous things soldiers could do. And because I was the shortest of my group, I'm about 5 foot tall, people joked about that. If I'd been a soldier during the First World War, that would have been my job, had I been a man, of course. And so like I was kind of fooling about, just running through the trenches for my friends. So that was one example of the more kind of like quote unquote funny moments of the trip. But there were also other moments that were much more sober. So here I'm in a Canadian military cemetery, also in France, by the grave of a military nurse called Agnes Macpherson, who was killed while serving in France. So she was serving in a field hospital that got bombarded. And I did an assignment for the course about the life of this military nurse. And as you can see on this picture, I'm quite tearful. And I think it's interesting to know I have no relation to this particular military nurse. I had never heard about her before completing my assignment, but there was obviously something about the dynamics of the group and the landscape of the site as well that initiated or invited a particular time of grieving or mournful connection to the sites. So I think this was really when it started for me, in the sense of like experiencing those different kinds of emotions in relation to the site. And much later, a few years later, I visited the USS Midway in San Diego in 2012. And this was, again, like an opportunity for me to see these mournful experiences. So for instance, like military ceremonies on the flight deck here that I did not witness in person, but there were other similar ceremonies when I was there. So this one in memory of the 9/11 attacks, but also some quite playful rituals. So here you have a flight simulator that's connected to the Operation Desert Storm. And so you have a panel saying, have your next birthday party at the simulator targeted at children. And this is a flight simulator where you would go inside and relive the like a mission, like a real mission that happened during Operation Desert Storm in Iraq. And you would hear the real recording of the voices of the pilots that carried out the mission. But it was cast in a very playful vibe. And that got me very interested in, because I was looking at this site now as a cultural outsider. And I wanted to learn more about how museums and memorials generate these kinds of emotional experiences.
No, that is certainly a fascinating way of getting the interest raised about this. So there's a lot to talk about. So I don't want to get too far ahead of our agenda here, but there's lots of questions I imagine already our viewers will want to engage you with. But can you tell us some of the insights that emerged from your research into the war memorials and the war museums?
Absolutely. Where I am right now is in thinking about museums and memorials as involved in the staging of war. And when I think about staging, I think about sets, and I think about embodied performances on the set. So part of my interest is in architectures and landscapes, and how inviting, for instance, visitors to encounter war on a ship, which is a particular form of architecture that invites certain forms of embodied movements in space, such as climbing in a flight simulator, climbing in a piece of aircraft, lying down in the bunk beds of the sailors, or climbing through ladders, exploring the different decks of the ship, sitting in the captain's seat. And all of these are interactions between visitors' bodies that are enabled by the way that the ship is available for us to visit, but also by what like docents on site, for instance, invite us to do, or the way that the ship is structured, like where we're allowed to go or not to go, what we're allowed to touch or not to touch. And my contention is that through these choreographies, the ships tell stories and produce knowledge about war through channels that are not like purely to do with the mind, but that are effective, that engage bodies and emotions. And through these bodily channels, people are gripped into certain perspectives on war. So I draw on like feminist and critical race scholars who have long argued that emotion and cognition are deeply connected. And so I'm using these examples to show that the knowledges and opinions that we hold about war are not simply like mind produced. They're also deeply connected to what we have felt in our bodies in experiences like these ones. One other related finding is that different architectures and landscapes produce different experiences of war and thus accomplish different kinds of political work. So I'll share my slides again, as I think it will be useful for me to illustrate this. Okay, so I have three different architectural forms that I'm interested in right now. The first one, as you have guessed, is the ship, the naval ship. And here we have a picture of the USS Missouri in Hawaii. So it's now berthed in Pearl Harbor, where it can be visited also as a historic naval ship. And the USS Missouri is where Japan, the Empire of Japan, signed the unconditional surrender to the United States at the end of World War II. So it's also like a really important historic ship. I'm also interested in tunnels. This particular tunnel here is located under Whitehall, so like the buildings of the United Kingdom's government in London. And it's part of a museum called the Churchill War Rooms. So it's the bunker where Winston Churchill and his cabinet withdrew to lead the war effort while the United Kingdom, and specifically London, were being bombarded by Nazi Germany during the war. So today it's a highly popular site of tourism. And if you're familiar with the film The Darkest Hour, it's also like the theater, literally the theater, where this film unfolds. So the tunnel site, I argue, is a different kind of architectural landscapes that is often frequently used to stage different kinds of stories of war, usually darker stories. So 9/11 Memorial is also a tunnel site because you go underground, right? And usually these are stories associated with like painful memories of war and memories of victimization. And finally, the mountain or the hill site is another architectural or landscape feature that is popular as a war memorial. And this particular one here is based at Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem. So Ammunition Hill used to be a site where ammunitions were stocked during the colonial era. So the British stocked ammunition there when they were the colonial authority in Palestine. But it's now an Israeli memorial site because it is from this hill that was launched the Battle of Jerusalem. So during the Six-Day War of 1967, where Israel conquered like many parts of what is now the occupied Palestine territory, but also East Jerusalem. This is where the battle was launched. And so you can visit it as a tourist today. And the hillside enables also very specific experiences of both tourism and commemoration that would not be possible in a different kind of landscape or architecture.
Yeah, no, this is a very compelling demonstration of the role of the physical space in shaping the way people understand the past. So one of the questions I have is about how you've gone about doing your work to achieve some understanding through various forms of evidence, the different methods that you've used. Could you talk about how you've shaped your work with attention to the how of doing it in terms of investigating sources, interpreting the data, the different theoretical frameworks that you've used to try to understand exactly what this all means?
I did fieldwork at many sites because people often ask, how did you choose the sites, right? And would you have discovered the same thing at different sites? So I cannot really answer the second question for sure, having not visited all memorial sites in the world. But I selected 8 sites for the book project. And these are sites that I was interested in because they all rehearsed the same 3-dimensional metaphors of war: the ship, the tunnel, or the hill. And they did so in ways that were highly compelling to the extent that they would attract large numbers of visitors every year. So almost all of these sites, every site but Ammunition Hill that I study, attracts over 1 million visitors a year from within the national space, but also many from abroad. So I was interested in sites that were sites of international communication, partly because they're embedded in networks of global tourism. And the way that I proceeded, I had several visits at most of the sites between 2012 and 2019. And my fieldwork evolved organically. And you mentioned that I have training in contemporary dance, and that is something that sort of spontaneously led me to pay attention to physical movements of body around the sites. And this was before I discovered fantastic literatures and performance studies and dance studies that I became very interested in after that. But during the fieldwork, I more organically just started taking lots of pictures of what it is that people were doing around the sites. I would take recording of the soundscapes. I would take sketches of the kind of bodily movements that people would do around the sites, or collect a lot of maps and artifacts. And in addition to all of this, like the recording of my own tactile interactions with the sites and sensorial interactions, I would then start collecting and documenting curators' perspectives, as well as a lot of reviews that have been produced by journalists, by activists who sometimes disagree with the way that memorials and museums present war. I'm particularly interested in the work of feminist activists and anti-racist activists as well. And also just regular visitors' reviews left on websites like TripAdvisor, which kind of give me an access into thousands of accounts of people's encounters with the sites.
And that is that's a great segue into my next question, because you've talked about different time periods. You've looked at the early world wars. You've looked at the the wars from the 60s, particularly the Israeli state taking over more territory in what is now occupied Palestine. You've looked at the U.S. involvement in Iraq as well, Desert Storm. In fact, I remember when that was happening, you could, as you were talking initially, you could actually get this is back in when people actually used VHS cassette tapes to watch video. It was the 90s, but you could get a video of the U.S. attacks on Iraq and what was called smart warfare technology and smart bombs. And it was I remember thinking a different kind of experience of war about being able to get a video and just sit back, plug it in your VCR and watch this. But it gets to your point about some of the things that are involved in shaping the way people understand war, and particularly what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. And I'm wondering if you might say something about the way your work is related to contemporary concerns and interests around remembering wars, and particularly the memorial sites and the museums, because this has gotten a lot of attention for many years, particularly in the past 12 to 18 months. And so would love to hear how you see connections between the work that you've done and some of these contemporary discussions.
It's been really fascinating to me to see how much conversation there has been, especially in the wake of the recent iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, around controversial statues and monuments. And I would say I would definitely share with those discussions an interest in how the material representation of history through fixtures like statues and monuments, how these, like their very existence in public space and our embodied interactions with them, how all of these are manifestations or contestations of unequal power relations. I think it's now very difficult not to think of those statues and monuments as inherently political and contested. So I've been like, that's a commonality. But where I think maybe differently about those issues is that, particularly in the US context, the debate around controversial statues and memorials has focused on violence that has mostly taken place within the national space. So if we think, for instance, about the Civil War monuments, whilst my work is more into questions of violence that is projected beyond the national space. And it seems to me that this use of force, use of state force, is not contested to the same extent, or is not scrutinized or interrogated to the same extent within those debates. So for instance, like the questions about the monuments, the Civil War monuments, usually have to do with like the heritage of slavery, for instance, and that's very important. These are very important questions to be explored. But I'm thinking about contemporary wars where there is still violence happening and state violence happening, and aren't we also questioning the way that more contemporary forms of war are also commemorated and memorialized? Because even though like the sites that I explore may be about World War II or the Six-Day War, but they're also about the present. Like they're informing the way we think about warfare that is more contemporary and recent. And so one thing that is fascinating about many of the sites I explore is that they will often commemorate several conflicts at the same time. So the USS Missouri, which commemorates World War II, also had an exhibition about the war in Afghanistan on the deck, of the ship. So the two conflicts are put together geographically in a way that also makes us think about them in similar terms.
Yeah, that's important because a couple of threads you pointed to that I want to quickly follow up on before we go further, and that is the tendency of debates in the U.S. to the degree that they are debates, to focus on the Civil War and not the United States engaging enemies that are other states beyond the borders of the United States. And then also, I want to go back to something as well. You talked about architecture and these ships as architecture, which is absolutely that. And anyone who has any connections to shipbuilding or construction would think, well, of course this is. But I'm not sure most people are so quick to connect ships to architecture. But of course, you've been paying a lot of attention to the way the organization of space causes people to move in a certain way, to compose their bodies in a certain way. And that's an important role of architecture. It is about controlling space and moving people in order to achieve a certain kind of, and here's a big term from your work again, a certain kind of affect, a certain kind of emotional disposition or emotional effect. So what could you just comment a little bit about why it's so important to pay attention to those things? Because they're not usually attended to by people, and that is the way that space acts on people's bodies to get them to move or to compose themselves in a certain way. And then this difference in what people tend to debate. We were talking about the U.S. I suspect this might be a trend transnationally, though, and that is the ways of remembering. I'm just going to use the category of foreign wars as a shorthand. We know the Civil War was a foreign war because there were two different states, but it was still a civil war because it used to be one country. You can't. That's very important. So I'm going to say that the role of remembering foreign wars and the relationship that has to nationalism. So could you just say a little bit about why it's so important to pay attention to those things?
Yes, the importance of paying attention to those things lies, first of all, in the high degree of influence and authority that museums and memorials hold. In the United States, according to the American Alliance of Museums, people trust museums more than they trust any other source of knowledge production. So more than they trust the media, more than universities, more than governments, more than NGOs, even more than the experiences of people they know personally. So there's a really special amount of authority that is invested in the museum. And I think this has to do with the fact that when people visit museums and memorials, the embodied and experiential nature of what they encounter there makes them feel like the knowledge is coming from within them. Okay. And that's why it's so powerful. But even though like we've been taught to believe that emotions come from within the heart or the body, Angela Davis has this fantastic quote, when she says that a lot of the things we feel from the inside has been placed elsewhere by the power of the state to make us like do the work of the state. And so what I'm interested in is how a lot of the like the management of space and crowds and objects and displays and settings often influences visitors through unconscious and subliminal channels. And curators know this and are very skillful in the way that they use this in order to tell stories that they think are important, but also in ways that can be, I don't want to say manipulative, but that can suggest more than we are able to acknowledge within the moment of visiting the exhibit. But once we start developing our, like, things, our skills, not only in critical thinking, but in critical feeling. So being able to be attentive to how the space is making us feel, I think we can start being more fine-tuned observers and more critical observers of what the spaces make us feel. And you mentioned there is so much that could be said, about nationalism, but I think certainly it is the case that the sites tend to focus on perspectives that are attached to an idea of the national self. And they will try to channel visitors into identifying with this national self, or operating with a kind of state of symbiosis with this national state. Even for visitors who come from abroad, the idea is still that those visitors will empathize with a certain idea and motive of this national entity.
So what do you think museums should be doing differently, and what do you think those who create memorials of war should change in order to address some of the big challenges that you have discovered in your work?
I join many of the current movements for diversifying museums and memorial spaces. And that's across the board, not just in war museums and memorials, but I think perhaps war museums and memorials might be some of the most resistant places to those suggestions that we need more diversity in terms of whose stories are represented, who sits on the boards, who sits on the trusts that fund the memorials as well. And of course, this is important for democratic reasons, because the memorials and museums should represent not only the voice of privileged groups within society, but all different groups. But my contention is also that if war memorials and museums diversify the types of stories of war that they tell, they're also more likely to offer more critical stories about war, to be more critical of war as an institution in and of itself. Mm. And right now, it seems to me that at least in the 8 memorials and museums that I study, which are all major memorials and museums in the UK, the US, and Israel, most of the perspectives that we are invited to embody as visitors are informed by the stories of white people, usually men or masculinized forms of subjectivities like soldiers, and usually also by citizens of the states where the memorial is located or the museum is located. And these kinds of perspectives usually lead to stories of war that are meant to reassure us that wars waged by states that call themselves democratic are just, legitimate, and waged in responsible ways that make the populations of these countries, but also all of the world, more secure. And this is where I think, we can ask a lot of questions. So I think that if we have more stories of war that are coming from women, from people of color, and also from foreign perspectives, we'll end up with different ideas about a more, more complex and richer and probably more honest encounter with a lot of what happens in war. And this, for me, what's interesting to me is, okay, what does this mean for the architecture? It means that it's not enough to just add, so on the USS Midway, you have these cardboard, shapes of sailors, and crew, and you have some white men, but you also have women in these cardboard shapes, and you have some service men of color. But just having that shape, it doesn't give us the story of that person. It doesn't tell us the story of how that person's experience of warfare might be different from that of the white guy. So I think that there are some questions also about how war can be staged differently to better account for a diversity of stories.
Well, I want to remind our audience that we would welcome your comments and questions. So if you're joining us through YouTube Live, you can put those into the comment box in the chat box. If you are joining us through the Zoom webinar link, then you can click the Q&A button at the bottom to send us your comments and questions. And so we have some already. I want to start with the one about the silences and absences. And so one of our audience members is asking whether or how your research explores these silences and absences. You just started talking about this, but if you could go a little bit further, they're asking, for example, about those absences that may hide or ignore controversial aspects or members of the battles that they commemorate. And they have a further question: have any memorials changed over time to give voice or presence to a silence or to an absence? And just also expressing gratitude for your talk.
Thank you. This is such a great question. And yes, I'm absolutely interested in silences and absences. And there are many examples that we could think of. So I'll start with Pearl Harbor, which is one of the sites I've been very interested in. And to me, one of the great silences and absences at Pearl Harbor are Native Hawaiian perspectives, because Hawaii was colonized by the United States largely because the US government of the time in the 1890s had an eye on Pearl Harbor as a potential military asset for the US to have in the Pacific. But when you visit Pearl Harbor nowadays, it's like history starts in 1941 with the attack by the Empire of Japan. And there's a whole history of military battle, like of military conquest and interaction between the US military and Native Hawaiian governments and people that is excluded from that story. So I think this is an example of absences and silences that illustrates how certain perspectives on war are definitely privileged at the expense of others.
No, that's a compelling example. I have another question here, showing appreciation for the way that your work makes it easier to see a form of staged ideology within the space. Thinking specifically of affect and looking at trip site reviews, this person is asking, have you seen the wide variety of feelings expressed? And do you see any resistance or reading against the mainstream account in these texts that you have been able to glean from TripAdvisor?
Thank you. That's really interesting. So this is a complex question. The question of resistance I'm very interested in, but I think that the TripAdvisor reviews actually have led me in the opposite direction, that overall they tend to evidence that a lot of people go along with the sites, at least the kinds of people who leave reviews on TripAdvisor. And this leads me to think that there is something about the integration of these sites in contexts of tourism and leisure that eases or that makes the ideological work of the memorial site easier in a sense. And in saying this, I go against some of the scholarship in this area. But it really seems to me that if you look at like hundreds and hundreds of TripAdvisor, like usually like people love Pearl Harbor. Like, you know, there's very few people who are actually going against the key message of the site. So in order to find that, I've had to look elsewhere and look more at activist networks on social media, like movements to decolonize the museum or decolonize memorials. And these are not the kind of this resistance is not expressed in places like TripAdvisor, where people will usually tend to, if they resist the site, it's not that it doesn't happen, but it's much less common for it to be expressed. Though you do see it sometime, including, interestingly, from some military veterans who find that the commercialization of the sites is disrespectful at times. So yeah, you can find some of it, but it's not, I would say, like, I've been actually surprised by how much expression of endorsement of the sites is actually found on sites like TripAdvisor.
Yeah, that is interesting. Another question: what is the role of regional, not national, but regional governments in war commemorations, and what affect or emotions are the governments and museums trying to invoke in the audience in war commemorations?
I mean, I'm not sure about regional governments, but I think what this question raises that is interesting is that there are multiple forms of institutional agency that intersect and interact at memorial sites. So many sites received some funding from governments, but a lot of them are nonprofit organizations, particularly the historic naval ships in the United States. Many of them are nonprofit organizations that do not receive funding from the government. And this has the effect of making them more reliant on forms of tourism rituals on site, things like buying souvenirs or buying lunch at the World War II themed cafe. And so it seems to me that it does have an effect, that reliance on private forms of consumptions at the site, in that the site feels the need to cater to these consumptive rituals in a way that makes war feel fun, accessible also to children, in ways that can be attractive to families, So I think it does have an effect in that way. And the effects that are being stimulated or invited are diverse, but they usually tend to alternate in that way between a form of pious, solemn sense of mourning and grief. And juxtaposed to that, you will have those spaces of family fun, entertainment that I just described, like have your birthday party at the simulator, right? Mm-hmm. And having these is becoming part of the effective grammar of how the sites operate. And usually the fun affects are located around stories of war or wartime events or uses of military force that are cast as legitimate. So you can have your birthday party at the simulator because Operation Desert Storm is thought of as a legitimate war. You cannot have your birthday party, say, on the USS Arizona Memorial, because that event is cast as an illegitimate use of force. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan is cast as an illegitimate use of state force. So there, the effects are solemn, right? So there's this whole effective grammar that builds into the imagination of certain war events as legitimate and some as illegitimate.
So another question, you mentioned going to the Churchill War Rooms in London. Did you also see the branch of the Imperial War Museum on the other side of the Thames, the former site of the Bethlehem Royal Hospital? And if so, what did you think of it by contrast with the Churchill War Rooms? And if you did visit, did you see the Culture Under the Attack exhibit? So this is one of our audience members has evidently been there and familiar with the site.
Hi, thanks for this question. Yes, so the main branch of the Imperial War Museum in London, the Imperial War Museum is the UK's national war museum dedicated to conflicts from the First World War till today. Is also, yes, it's part of my of my 8 sites. And I have seen this exhibition, although I focus on permanent exhibitions in the context of my work. What I think about the Imperial War Museum is yeah, I try to like focus on what I think will be most interesting to audiences here. Okay, so Paul Gilroy has this phrase, imperial, what is it called? Imperial, it's post-colonial melancholy, that he says has to do in the UK with a rejection of engagement with the violence that was part of the British Empire and the violence that also took place in the context of the deliquescence of the empire. And to me, the Imperial War Museum is a kind of architectural expression of that post-colonial melancholy, because there's an absolute refusal to engage with this violence. So you can hear about many wars that the UK has been engaged in, but not about the violence of empire, which I think is quite fascinating. And they're in the context right now, they're in the process of rebuilding a lot of the exhibits. So we'll see if that will change in the near future. But I think it's a very interesting case of refusal to engage with the perspectives of the people in the UK who are descendants of formerly colonized populations, but that have different stories to tell compared to people who have not been part of those populations.
So this is a question about critical feeling. Can you say more about how you think and feel about the role of critical feeling, which is not necessarily as the substitute for critical thinking, but maybe in connection to that, because you talked about the emotional response as well as narrative that is shaped by these memorials?
Thank you. I think the best way to answer this question is to invite people to do a little bit of archaeology of their own feelings around memorials and museums, which has been part of my research process. And it's something I borrow from autoethnography as a method in some ways. So, and this started for me when I was either attracted or repulsed by some souvenirs in souvenir shops. So there were some things that were kind of obvious to me as bizarre, you know. So one of these was the military tags. So in some of the U.S. naval ships, they were selling military tags, and I thought that was so strange. And why would you buy this? And then I learned fascinating things about military tags and how there's also a story of like anti-war activism that made use of them. And so I saw that I was very narrow-minded in my perception of them. But anyway, I thought it was interesting that I had this response to them. Inversely, at the Imperial War Museum, they had this lovely stationery that was developed for the commemoration of the centenary of the First World War. And I thought, oh, actually, if I was quick, I could grab it. But I thought it was so beautiful, and I bought it. And I also bought some tea towels for my mom and stuff. And this said something to me when I thought about it a bit more critically, about how that museum was catering to a kind of consumer subjectivity that I could be hailed into a lot more easily. And this to me also said something about how the museum was catering to, let's say, a particular kind of social class in the way that it constructed itself and constructed its aesthetics that could also be like something to question. And so I think critical feeling for me had to do with this, had to do with like interrogating my own emotional reactions to the site and using that as a way to ask questions about the site and what kind of subjectivities it invited and it favored at the expense of others.
So another question, thanking you for the great talk and asking, have you found curators using these spaces to undermine assumed visions that these museums traffic in? In other words, are there spaces of contestation or contradiction that are purposely designed?
Yes. The Imperial War Museum is a great example of this. So they have been using artwork, especially to, and specifically temporary exhibitions and artwork in these temporary exhibitions to talk about these more uncomfortable episodes of violence, specifically relating to the violence of empire and of the like the wars of the decolonial era. And I think that these are very interesting, and there's a lot of artists of color, you know, who come, say, like who have like origins in Pakistan or in certain African countries that were colonized by the British, who have been exhibited there. And that's very interesting. However, there are two things that are striking to me about these exhibits is that they isolate those critical perspectives from those perspectives that are presented in the permanent exhibits, which are focused around the more like kind of traditional white British narratives. So there's like a spatial isolation of the two that reproduces a form of marginalization in architectural terms, because you have the two in different spaces. And also temporally, one is only there for a few months and the other one is permanent. And the other thing that I thought was very interesting about these like more resistant voices presented in these artwork formats, so a lot of contemporary art, for instance, is that artwork was not deemed suitable to talk about other forms of violence, namely the Holocaust and anti-Semitic violence. So when it came to the Holocaust, it was deemed as a form of violence that was beyond representation and beyond art. And using art to talk about the Holocaust would be like aestheticizing it. And that was deemed inappropriate and wrong. But it was appropriate to talk about the violence of colonization and empire. And so I thought that that was also something to question, you know, that there seemed to be different standards in terms of aesthetic representation of violence that were at work within that particular museum that I thought were at least worthy of interrogation of why these distinctions were made.
Yeah, great. So we have just a few minutes left, and there are three questions remaining. I'm going to try to get through. One of these is about the embodied experiences, and the other two have some implications for how things might look differently in teaching and in museums. So the first one, again, thanking you for the presentation and asking, does the embodied experience of warships, command centers, or fortifications with their sharp focus on action have an impact that distracts visitors from considering silences such as imperialism or settler colonialism in the United States, the UK, or Israel, as they try to simulate the emotional rush of battles that can be packaged as touristic fun or as mementos.
Yes, I think that is the case, but I don't think that it's necessarily to do with the fact that there is, well, oh, I see where the person is coming from. Yes. So I think this is an allusion to differences between fast movement and slow movement. Mm-hmm. And in the ships in particular, like, yes, there are some invitations to do fast movements, like run around and move through ladders. And that this, I don't know if it's a distraction as such, but it's true that in general, you see more fast movement where you have the more like fun affects that present warfare in a more like playful, adventurous light. In contrast to this, whenever war is presented as something painful and destructive, usually visitors are invited to walk slowly or stay in place. And that is partly how we receive the message that something bad happened. It's because we have to slow down and children have to be reined in. So yes, I see what you're saying with regard to this. But there are also parts of the ship that can sometimes be reserved for, say, memorial services, where the slow, the slow movements can also be required. And that can also be a way to distract from forms of violence that are perpetrated abroad, but by focusing attention on the violence and victimization that has happened within the national space, like in the example of the 9/11 memorial on the USS Midway that I showed a picture of later.
Well, thanks for that. So we'll end with these last two, which I think I'll try to place together because they're asking more prescriptively what you think should happen in context. And one asked you to imagine a museum or memorial of the future that can convey experiences of violence, bringing the critical reflexivity that you're encouraging in your work. And so could you imagine that type of scenario or setting? And the other question is asking something in the same vein, but within the context of teaching, of that, particularly with your comment about how people tend to trust the authority of museums and memorials. And so they're wondering how this might translate to the way that that understanding might translate to the way we teach in the classroom to benefit students from, for example, using bodily experiences or movements or other methods. So one is a museum of the future. Could you imagine one that would do the kinds of things you're calling for? The other, what are the implications for teaching?
Thank you. Museum of the future. I'm very interested right now in conversations about decolonizing the museum. And the activist Shaheen Kasmani in the UK has said something along the lines of decolonizing the museum is like trying to make a slaughterhouse vegan. So in other terms, I think she's emphasizing that the museum as such is an institution of colonialism and empire, and that there is perhaps something inherently connected between the museum or exhibition experience and the politics and logics of empire. So perhaps the museum of the future should not exist. But the alternative vision is that decolonization can also be a spectrum and a process. And so perhaps the museum of the near future is something between that and what we have right now. And following Professor Tarak Barkawi at the LSE, I think of maybe a museum of the future. So he talks about decolonizing war. how can we decolonize the concept of war? And one thing he suggests is to reconsider temporality. So reconsider, for instance, how we use the First and Second World War as these major landmarks around which everything else has to be understood and constructed. And he offers like stories of decolonization, for instance, as offering a different temporality. So going back to the Pearl Harbor example, right? Which wars are we commemorating at Pearl Harbor might be the question here. And the second advice that he offers is to, which is connected, is to remember the so-called small wars. So wars that from the perspective of the West are imagined as smalls. So in the US, we could think, for instance, of the war in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, but that are not small from the perspective of people who lived through those wars. Mm-hmm. So maybe like wars, memorials and museums of the future could like reconsider the way they tell those stories. And about teaching, so teaching on conflict and war has been very humbling for me. And I have a lot of empathy for curators, actually, because I feel like as teachers of conflict and war, we occupy a similar position and we meet many of the same challenges that curators meet in terms of like, how can we offer like critical and contextualized histories of war, but that are also receivable by students. So right now we're during COVID and we are asked to be very mindful of the students' mental health, which is completely legitimate. But that also means that for me, I constantly think about things that I maybe should not ask the students to do because that would be too challenging, you know, from emotional perspectives. And I don't want people who are already suffering from, you know, a difficult mental health situation to have to engage with very difficult knowledge of war. But at the same time, that also puts certain boundaries, you know, on what I can say and how far I can ask the students to engage with those stories, which is also important on a civic level. So I'm still struggling with those dilemmas, and I welcome suggestions from those who have more wisdom than me.
Well, thank you for really fascinating sharing of the work that you're doing, Professor Reeves. Thanks for our audience members. There's so much to discuss here. So thanks for all the questions and comments we received. And we'll hope you'll join us in the future for another faculty research colloquium. But really terrific, exciting research. Thanks so much. Glad everyone could join us.